Hi, I'm Nathan from Serious Geeks, and in this video we're going to continue the Tactica series with the Gladiator battle tank from Codex Space Marines. This vehicle is the most recent battle tank released for Codex Space Marines, and as you can see on the screen, it does look marvellous. It has certainly recaptured some of the magic that was the original Predator battle tank, and it certainly looks the part. Its image definitely looks like a Space Marine vehicle that you come to expect, and it would slot in alongside your older Space Marine vehicles quite nicely without a jarring abruptness when it comes to the theme. Like the Predator that came before it, the Gladiator has different variants that have different armament depending on the role of the vehicle. The Valiant, the Reaper, and the Lancer. Although their weapons are different, and therefore the role and use of the vehicle may change, the stat line is common to all three variants of the vehicle, and that is a great place to start, as always. So when reviewing a vehicle, the first thing to look at is the toughness value. How heavy is this vehicle in comparison to other vehicles in the game and the weapons likely to target it? The Gladiator tanks all have a toughness value of 8, which is a high milestone in the game. A lot of vehicles that have toughness 8 are considered very heavy and are relatively difficult to destroy in comparison to other vehicles. The critical element is twofold. Firstly, units that have a strength 4 predominantly can only wound this vehicle on a 6. That is actually quite a difficult thing to do. Fishing for 6s is not ideal when it comes to destroying anything. So you can rest assured that small arms fire will generally avoid targeting a vehicle like this, especially as it has a 3-up armor save. Secondly, many anti-tank weapons are strength 8. The crack missile, for example, is strength 8, which means it will only wound this vehicle on a 4+. Melter weapons, which are very popular in the meta right now, will also similarly only wound this vehicle on a 4+. The other side of the durability of this vehicle is its wounds value. Having 12 wounds puts it firmly in the same bracket as a Lehman Russ. We consider a Lehman Russ battle tank to have 12 wounds and toughness 8 to be fairly durable, so we can consider the same for the Gladiator. Being Space Marines, the last part of the stat line is it hits on a 3+, it has 3 attacks standard, and then when it degrades, it obviously decreases in movement, ballistic skill, and attacks as normal. The last factor of this vehicle is its movement value, which is actually surprisingly low. Of course, movement 10 is still fairly good. Units usually have a movement of 6, so you're moving 4 inches extra a turn, but when you compare this to, say, the Predator, Annihilator and Destructor both have a movement value of 12. This means as a hunter vehicle it is slightly slower than the other vehicles, but being slightly tougher at that expense. It has 1 extra wound and an extra point of toughness over its Predator rival. So that's all fairly easy. We've got the stat line of the vehicle. What are the other factors we have to bear in mind? Well, they're all heavy support choices, and they all have the same 3 upgrades that are attributable to the vehicle. 1 Iron Hail Heavy Stubber, 1 Icarus Rocket Pod, and 1 lot of auto launchers on any vehicle, each one costing 5 points each. To be honest, most of those upgrades are not really necessary. They are an as and when whether you really need them sort of upgrade. If you have the 5 points spare, you're taking these for the main armament of the vehicle in general anyway. Of particular note here are the auto launchers, which cost 5 points per vehicle. This gives the model the smokescreen keyword, which all the other original Space Marine vehicles have as standard anyway. Basically, you've got the option whether you want to pay the 5 points that is baked into the cost of other vehicles to add to these vehicles themselves, or not. Lastly, the very last factor to look into is all 3 variants of the vehicle do not have the core keyword. As always, this means things like a captain's rights of battle does not affect the Gladiator battle tank, and you have to plan accordingly. Generally, this means the Gladiator is operating semi-independently. It's going to be an autonomous unit across the table and doesn't have to be within range of your other more friendly units to really benefit from their boosts. So you can actually use it without having to worry and plan ahead like that. Looking at the variants now, we can see that the first one, the Gladiator Lancer, is predominantly a long-range anti-tank weapon. Its main weapon, the Lancer Laser Destroyer, has a massive range of 72 inches and fires twice each turn, being heavy 2, at strength 10, so it'll be wounding most targets on a 3+, if not a 2+, with a -3 AP, and does a damage of D3 +3. This unit does have a unique special rule, the Aquilin Optics, which gives it a +1 to its attack's hit roll for the laser destroyer. Although it has lost its ability to fly, despite being a hover tank, it's still a fast enough moving vehicle to be able to hide behind obscuring terrain and then pop out to lay its heavy firepower on an enemy vehicle or monster. It does excel at this. It has the movement value to be able to do so, and it has heavy firepower to be able to wound even knights on a 3+, so you can rest assured that the basilisk hiding at the end of the table or that knight castellan is going to suffer damage when it's hit with this vehicle. It's going to be firing 2 shots, hitting on a 2+, which makes up for the lack of rerolls that it has access to, or doesn't in this case, and it will be able to do a lot of damage at D3 plus 3 damage apiece. This vehicle is not particularly decisive. You're unlikely to destroy your target in one hit, especially a knight, of course. You can only do a maximum of 12 damage, and that's unlikely, but you are likely to heavily damage a target and do a substantial amount versus a knight. Where this falls down is against targets which have an inbuilt invulnerable save, and if you fail to wound, as an example, you're wounded on the 3+, you're only going to be potentially getting one of those D3 plus 3s through. As such, it's more of a vehicle that is used in contribution to other long-range firepower units that you might have to be able to give you a little bit of touching ability against enemy backline units. The secondary weapons on this is it can be upgraded to have 2 Fragstorm grenade launchers replacing its 2 Storm Bolters. These are range 18, assault D6, strength 4 and blast. Generally you'll prefer to stick to the Storm Bolter because it has longer range and you get 4 shots guaranteed each turn with those Storm Bolters. It's neither here nor there. Most people would probably go for the Storm Bolters, but if you're up against Orcs, for example, you might want to use the Fragstorm grenade launchers or Genestealer Cult, but it's not really why you would take this vehicle, so don't worry too much about that. The biggest weakness of this vehicle is for 2 strength 10 AP -3 damage D3 plus 3 shots, it costs 200 points, which is a lot to invest. It's not a terrible weakness, 200 points is quite manageable, but you're starting to get into quite an expensive unit and you're pushing towards a Land Raider, which is a lot more survivable and has more firepower. The vehicle definitely has a place in most lists, but it's not particularly powerful when you consider that you can get a long-range Predator for cheaper that has more las cannon shots and therefore more firepower. The reason you're taking this vehicle is because it's toughness 8 and you want to be able to have as much saturation in your armoured units as possible, and you want this to be able to survive a bit longer while your Rhinos, your Impulses, your Redemptor Dreadnoughts, your Contemptors are moving forward and taking all the shots. The very next Gladiator to talk about is the Reaper. It has a twin heavy onslaught Gatling cannon as its standard armament, which is a range 30, heavy 24, strength 6, AP -1 and damage 1 weapon. Thanks to the movement value of 10, you can guarantee, almost, that this vehicle will always be in range. Supplementing that firepower, it has 2 Tempest launchers, which are basically mini Hurricane bolters. It's a rapid fire 4 bolter at AP -1, rather than a rapid fire 6 bolter with no AP at all. This vehicle's sweet spot is within half range, 15 inches. If it does so, it's going to be shredding any infantry target it fires at. Even 2 wound Space Marines are going to worry about taking this many shots. It's at this point you can kind of understand why Games Workshop took away the core keyword and introduced it to other units from things like the Gladiator Reaper, so that they can't get all the benefits of the rerolls from captains and lieutenants, because that would be absolutely monstrous. It does pay for these weapons. It costs 230 points standard, extra 5 points if you want it to have a Iron Hail Heavy Stubber added to the mix, which is an extra 4 shots, which is always nice. And you would probably want the auto launchers as well, just to keep this thing alive a bit longer if you're investing that kind of points in it. That would rack it up to 240 points. This is very obvious its biggest weakness. 230 to 240 points is incredibly high. It also puts itself within harm's way because you're going to want to get it up close to get the maximum amount of firepower out of it. Although that isn't essential, you can still operate at ranges of 30 fairly effectively, but you're not going to be touching many vehicles with it, so it has a bit of a niche in that it's going to be fighting infantry predominantly and plinking away wounds off larger targets. So it becomes a little bit difficult to justify 230 points into a list. Another factor that plays against it is that you already have quite a lot of anti-infantry weapons in a Space Marine army anyway, so do you really need something that dedicated? I hear the answer from many of you might be yes, because it does take care of the anti-infantry problem if you do stock up on anti-tank weapons, but most people will have intercessors, assault intercessors in their Primaris army, so it's not really an issue in that regard. So think carefully about whether you want to add a Gladiator Reaper, but remember the amount of dice you roll is going to be absolutely phenomenal. The last version to talk about is the Gladiator Valiant. This one has weaponry that we're probably a bit more familiar with if you're an old school Space Marine player or even an Imperial player in general. It has 2 sponson mounted multi-melters which are heavy 2 now, so that's 4 melter shots, which are incredibly potent as we all know. And it also has a twin linked las talon, which basically is heavy 4 las cannon, which only has a range of 24, but that marries up quite nicely with the multi-melter. This vehicle has an astonishing amount of anti-tank firepower. It does pay those points for it though. It costs 250 points, the most out of all the Gladiator variants. If you want to add upgrades to it, that's on top of that, and you're probably not going to want to add the Iron Hail Heavy Stubber because what use is it going to be? It's just 4 extra bolter shots and you're already forking in a lot of points to it. The auto launchers are always good because it's sometimes nice to use smoke screen, especially if you're investing 250 plus points into a vehicle. And the Icarus rocket pod, well, if you need anti-air, then use it, but most people won't bother. The main role of this vehicle is to hunt other vehicles at a reasonable range. Because of its large amount of anti-tank firepower, it doesn't have to worry too much about getting within 12 inches, which is the sweet spot for the melter shots. Aside from the points cost, the biggest weakness of this vehicle is the fact that it competes directly with eradicators and attack bikes, and to a lesser extent, land speeders, for that anti-tank capacity. Sure, multi-melters are great, and putting them on this vehicle, which is quite mobile, is going to be very powerful, but you're going to be putting other units a lot closer that are cheaper and more effective at doing so. As an example, attack bikes are faster than this vehicle, and you also know that they're cheaper, so you're not going to be as upset if they rush forward and get absolutely murdered after destroying an enemy vehicle. This vehicle, on the other hand, the Gladiator Valiant, is so expensive that you're going to want to get as much of a return of it as possible. Another element that's quite difficult to get the most out of is if you're going to be getting up close to knights with those melter shots, because obviously strength 8 versus toughness 8 means that the melter shots might actually bounce off, especially with an invulnerable save. So the damage that does get through, you want it to be as potent as possible, which means getting within half range. But of course, if you do that, then you're likely to be charged and you're likely to be destroyed in turn, which is a big problem for a vehicle that is so expensive. Regardless of this weakness, it is still a very potent vehicle, and in the right list, such as one that uses plenty of vehicles to be a distraction to the opponent, such as Redemptors, Contemptors, Ironclads, Impulsors, a Land Raider perhaps moving forward, all your more aggressive vehicle elements will probably soak up a lot of the fire. So if this thing's gunning towards them, it would be a nice little bit of target saturation that could help out. Overall though, if we come to a summary of all 3 vehicles, the biggest problem is the same for each of them. They are very expensive for what they do. They all bring a lot of pain to the table, particularly the Reaper and the Valiant. But could you find points elsewhere to have cheaper options? I think so. As an example, the Predator Annihilator is going to come in at less points than the Lancer, but have more firepower in total because it has 4 las cannon shots potentially. Sure, it's a little bit less survivable, but if you're hitting either vehicle with a las cannon, it makes no difference. The only difference between both of them is one of them has 1 wound more than the other. Both of which would be wound on a 3+ against the las cannon shot. In a similar fashion, the Gladiator Reaper has a hell of a lot of firepower, but it competes directly with things like Redemptor Dreadnoughts, which in turn have a lot of firepower, but also some close combat capacity as well. As I said before, the Gladiator Valiant has a very potent amount of firepower, but again, you're using it as an anti-tank weapon, which you already have plenty of in the army list in the form of eradicators and attack bikes. It's a big points investment that could basically go on 2 other units which have a similar capacity that can cover more vehicles and more targets and not be pushed out and taken down in one go. So in summary, I would say use these vehicles with caution. They might work well if you have plenty of other attacking elements in the army that are also vehicle based, such as a couple of Redemptors, maybe an Impulsor or two. Then one of these in the back could really make a difference. But again, because I think the points value is so high, you've got to be very careful using these units because they will make your army very small. Once one of them is taken out, then you lose a large portion of your firepower and a large portion of your list. Don't get me wrong, I don't think that any of the vehicles are complete trash. I actually think they're all relatively useful in their own way, but they have to have a particular kind of build behind them. If you add one of these vehicles to your army list that is all infantry, then you're wasting your points. You're going to see it destroyed very easily by enemy anti-tank, and it's going to be an easy choice for your opponent. Where I think these units really will shine is when you have a lot of original firstborn armour vehicles, such as Dreadnoughts that are only toughness 7 with 8 wounds, or Razorbacks, Rhinos, and a few Predators as well. These vehicles are often cheaper and therefore can be taken in larger numbers, and then you have this as their big brother that is going to be babysitting a lot of them and adding its firepower to the mix. At that point, you've got quite a lot of target saturation and it becomes a really solid investment. If your army has a lot less armoured vehicles in it, it might have some really expensive ones such as Repulsors, Land Raiders, or even things like Redemptor Dreadnoughts that are fairly expensive. Then you might not be able to afford putting in one of these Gladiators as well because they're expensive and you're going to reduce the size of your army. But if your army does have a lot of those smaller vehicles, then you could probably do quite well to have a Gladiator alongside them. The very last thing to cover is, just so that everyone's aware, there doesn't appear to be any stratagem support that will help these vehicles. There might be one or two in the particular supplements that might help bolter rounds, for an example, but you'll probably be using those on other vehicles anyway, because these have very few bolter shots in general. So apart from that, we just have Smokescreen, which is quite useful. It would be best used on the vehicle that is probably the most expensive or critical to your plan. And it means that any enemy unit that fires at your smoke-screened unit is going to have a -1 to hit. This, coupled with toughness 8, is very nice, and it means that you may actually get a bit more survivability out of your expensive investment. That's all there really is to say about this vehicle. I've managed to cover 3 in 1 here, so please let me know what you think in the comments below. Please like and subscribe. I can't push that enough. I'm really trying to grow the channel, and it helps me no end to be able to like, subscribe and share it. So please feel free to do so, and I'll catch you all soon, guys. Thank you for listening. Peace out.